So we're going to go from left to right, and each panelist has been asked to talk for 4 or 5 minutes, introduce their organization, introduce the issues that they care about, and then we'll kick off the discussion. So starting with Jake Colvin. He's the Executive Director of the Global Innovation Forum, and he's also Vice President at the National Foreign Trade Council. He works on a range of trade issues. And the fun fact about Jake is that in his spare time, he also blogs at a blog for fashion for geeks. So modernfellows.com. If you want to be cool, you want to be hip in the digital age, check out modernfellows.com. So as you can see, he's the best dressed person here. So Jake, go to it.
Well, thank you, I think. Really appreciate the introduction, Mike, and really appreciate ISOC's invitation to be here and WeWork. I hope you'll forgive a few notes. I promise I won't read from entirely from prepared remarks, but I've got a couple of little ones at home and haven't been sleeping much, so if I don't refer to notes, I may not remember anything.
Can you hear Jake in the back there? Is he coming through? You might just have to bring it closer to your mouth. The other thank you I forgot was to say thank you to Paul Brigner, who is the master of all things webcast, and also has managed to make the microphones work for us. So how's that, Jake?
All right, hopefully that's a little bit better. So I'm with the Global Innovation Forum at the National Foreign Trade Council, and what we do is we engage entrepreneurs with corporations and public policymakers to talk about, to elevate the opportunities of engaging in the global marketplace these days, and to explore how to overcome some of the challenges that exist. So the idea is that it's not just large multinational corporations that are going global, it's startups that are small, and even from day one they're global. You put up a website, you get a couple of good press hits, and all of a sudden you've got to figure out how to fulfill demand or interest from 16 countries around the world. And these are stories that we hear every day, not just in the United States, but elsewhere around the world. So I just want to talk a little bit about trust. And when I think about the things that get more difficult as you go internationally, for me it's gaining visibility so people can decide whether to trust you in the first place, then establishing trust with your partner or buyer, and fulfilling on that trust by delivering the good or service or partnership that you promised. Now this is, for a variety of reasons, harder as you go global, but the great thing about the internet is that it's all a lot easier now thanks to digital technologies. So Mike mentioned my blog about men's style. Think of a company like Black Lapel, which is based up in New York. They're an online made-to-measure suiting company. So you plug in your measurements to a website, you pay $500, and 4 weeks later you get a custom suit that fits really well. They're based in New York, got about 10 people there, manufactured out of Shanghai, and in its first full year of operation, exported to over 70 countries around the world. Now 10 years ago that would have been impossible, but these guys have a very savvy media strategy, they're great social networkers, and they've got logistics and customer service down pat. And so this is a great global story. So I thought maybe I'd talk through a couple of ways in which startups broadly have trust tools thanks to digital technologies in the private sector, but then how public policy can enable or disable access to those tools. So the first is a little bit old-fashioned. It's having a good media strategy, although that becomes a little bit easier or more diverse in the digital age. You don't just need a good hit in the Washington Post. You can build reputation through blogs like mine and give yourself credibility or cachet. The second is social and professional networks help to shrink distance, and I've got a great example that I can talk about later about a Nigerian who was invested in by a New York VC investor thanks to LinkedIn, if you're interested. But then, there are platforms like Thumbtack and Elance and eBay that kind of foster trust in unknown quantities. There's one here tonight that does the same thing by building online marketplaces, by providing services and guarantees that sort of enable trust in these unknown quantities. Then there's financing. If you accept PayPal or even M-Pesa on your website, and you don't have to, and the customer doesn't have to provide their information to another merchant, that's a good thing too. And then globally, language is a big one. And so, I've been on Alibaba before, and I've There are some pretty slick pictures there, but if you read the English, it's written in a way that would make me think twice about buying something from someone on Alibaba. But there are these wonderful tools out there from startups like Unbabel and Babelverse that are making it easier and using technology to translate and provide services in native speakers' own languages. And so these are helping to shrink distance and improve trust. I guess just turning briefly to the role of government, in my mind the role of government is making sure that all those technologies are allowed to develop while appropriately protecting consumers. So what governments can do is enable or disable access to these technologies and also impede or enable businesses to fulfill the things that they transact online, to deliver the goods or services that they promise to others around the world. And so I'll maybe just offer 2 examples and a solution, if that's all right with you.
I like solutions.
Partial solutions. So if you're in China, you don't have access to Facebook, which means that we all here don't have one really useful channel for gaining visibility and establishing trust with businesses and customers and citizens in China. And a more mundane example, I think, is if you go to Switzerland and you order a package from a company called Fresh Paper, if you order something called Fresh Paper from a company that we've gotten to know based in Maryland called Fenugreen, you're going to receive this thing along with a bill for 300% of its value, because the tariff on this Fresh Paper is 300% in Switzerland. It's this really cool thing. It's a piece of paper that you stick in a bag of apples to keep it fresh for up to 4 times longer. And there's this wonderful entrepreneur out in Maryland who sells this all around the world, but never again to Switzerland, because no one's going to pay 300% on top of the purchase price in order to get this thing. So the solution, one of the solutions is trade agreements. And trade agreements can knock down barriers to things like tariffs in Switzerland, but also ensure that the digital economy is open, at least for those countries that want to participate in those trade agreements. What we're trying to do at the Global Innovation Forum is more basic than that, which is to elevate the success stories and point out the challenges that exist for those startups that are looking to go global, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere around the world. And so hopefully use that to convince governments who might be otherwise inclined to restrict access to these technologies that it's not in their interest to do so. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. You can pass the microphone to Danielle. Danielle is a policy analyst at the Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New America Foundation. I've worked with the New America Foundation for quite some time. It's one of the most interesting think tanks and do tanks around. OTIA in particular has been building things and not only advising and telling people what to do, they're doing it themselves. They're making some very exciting things happen around the world. Danielle's been looking at the impact of U.S. surveillance on American business around the world and how that has decreased trust. She's done a lot of good work on privacy and what we need to do to get interoperable privacy policies around the world. I'll let her dive in here and talk a little bit about some of the policy problems and the policy solutions that we can hope for.
All right, thank you. You guys can all hear me now? Mike kind of stole my intro, which was I was going to tell you what New America and OTI does. But I think just to sort of add a little bit to that, so what we, in the past year or 2 years, one of the big things that we've been studying, obviously we're looking at the role of, the interactions between governments and companies and the public sector and trying to understand sort of how we can promote policies that enable safe and affordable and ubiquitous access to the internet, that allow the expansion of the tools that we enjoy here, enabling free expression, sort of basically just making sure that we live in a world where people globally can access the tools they need to learn new information, to buy things online, sort of all the good stuff that the internet does in the most basic way. And so one of the big things that we've been looking at, which obviously has been on a lot of people's mind, is how the actions of governments, and particularly in the last 2 years, the U.S. government in the surveillance space, have impacted the growth and the interactions of that network. And so what the revelations about what the U.S. government has been doing in terms of collecting data, in terms of trying to undermine the security of the internet, and in terms of looking for ways both overtly and covertly to work with companies with or without their knowledge to actually get access to information about their users, what that actually does for people's trust in those technologies, what it does for the growth of the network, how it can lead to fragmentation, and then sort of what we can do about that. So the two issues that I think are, there are a lot of issues in this space that are critically important for building trust and for regaining that trust. Two of the ones that I would talk about are, one, the risk of fragmentation. So one of the big things that's happened in the past few years after the Snowden leaks is we've seen a lot of governments in foreign countries and a lot of companies looking for ways to reassure people that their data is safe from NSA spying. And they've done that in a variety of ways, one of which is to say, let's store data locally in certain places, let's change the routing structure of the internet so that we don't go through the United States, so that we make it harder for the NSA to get access to our data. Let's start moving away from American companies because we don't trust them. We think they might be working with the NSA, and what that does to particular industries and to people's access to communications. So obviously, it's no surprise that when people don't trust companies, they're not going to become customers of those companies. It means that they may actually use the internet less overall. They're not going to try new tools. And it's going to sort of have a really detrimental effect on the innovation and growth of the network. I think in the case of NSA surveillance, particularly for American companies, but even just sort of the general move to cloud computing, this idea that you'd have people storing their data not on their local machines, but in the cloud, requires trusting the company that you're going to give your data to. So one of the big risks is that in the backlash to all of the information that we've learned about what intelligence agencies are doing, is that people are going to trust companies less, and they're going to use the internet less for all of the great things that we want them to use it for. So I think there are a lot of ways in which we can, and I think we'll get into this, promote public policies that actually rebuild that trust and that think about how to make the network more interoperable and how to make it grow rather than how to sort of fragment it and separate it and have people be concerned. And the second thing, of course, is actually trusting that the data that you're sending over the network is secure, that when you put your credit card information into your web browser, that that no one can intercept that data and steal your identity. And a lot of that is based on the use of encryption technology. So that's another thing that I think in the past couple years has sort of reemerged as something that we're talking about on a daily basis. And it makes a lot of people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about encryption and mathematical algorithms scrambling data to protect it, but it's incredibly important for the way the internet works, for the growth of the internet economy, and for people's ability to trust that their communications are secure and that they're not going to be broadcasting their information to the world in a way that they don't want to be. So you can put it on Facebook if you want to, but you don't want everyone to have access to your credit card information. So I think that the second big thing is that when we have these public policy debates about use of encryption, we're seeing competing interests. We're seeing companies and users that want to protect their privacy, that want to make sure that they have the strongest possible protections against unwanted surveillance, against cybercrime. And you also see a national security and a law enforcement interest in being able to access data when you're investigating crimes, when you're looking to stop terrorist plots. So we're seeing the emergence of this debate right now in the US as companies like Apple and Google and lots of smaller companies, so startups, companies like WhatsApp are using a lot more encryption as an attempt to regain the trust of their customers, a lot of which was they lost after the Snowden leaks. And then you're seeing the backlash from that right now, which is that people, high-ranking law enforcement and intelligence officials are coming out and saying this is a problem. That this is potentially making life easier for criminals, that this is really actually bad for the future of the internet. And so one of the big public policy questions that we're fighting right now, and that I think is going to be really important going forward, is how do we figure out how to get around that impasse so that people can continue to put their trust in these products, so that the internet continues to grow, but so that we're also taking into account legitimate, security concerns. So those are the two big things that I would say I think at this moment and in the past few years are very important. And with that, I'm going to stop talking for now, and I look forward to discussing this more.
Okay.
Do I get both?
No, you only get one. Before you start up, Eric, I wanted to ask Danielle a question about the numbers.
Sure.
I've seen a lot of numbers on how much the Snowden revelations have meant for American business. How much money have they lost? How many sales have not happened? And the numbers are big. They're 20, 30, 50. What's your number? Which number do you think makes is a good, solid number on this one?
So I think one of the big numbers, and this is just the cloud computing industry, the number was $22 to $180 billion. And the reason why that range is so large is because that's an incredibly fast-growing industry, and it is, as I sort of mentioned, its growth is based in part on people's willingness to trust those companies, and so it's in part that American business, we'd lose business overseas, and it's in part that people who don't already store their data in the cloud wouldn't start doing it. The companies wouldn't trust the cloud computing companies, and so they wouldn't be able to give them their data or their business.
Okay.
So that's one of the numbers. But I think more importantly, a lot of people said this when we were researching for the study we did last year, was the numbers don't matter because by the time we have a number, it will be so large and the damage will be so irreversible that everything is lost.
Yeah.
And their point being that we need to work before we can put a real number on the losses from the loss of trust after the Snowden leaks. We need to be doing something to fix it, and so that's I think the bigger takeaway for me.
Okay, great. I forgot to mention the fun fact about Danielle, which is that if you follow her on Twitter, you will get some of the best insights on what's going on at all these various internet governance meetings around the world. She's a very reliable blogger and doesn't waste your time with little trivia stuff, just gets to the heart of the matter.
Sometimes, brunch gets in there, but rarely.
Well, she's worth reading on Twitter. And we do have the Twitter addresses for everybody here, and our hashtag today is just ISOCDC, ISOCDC. Our next speaker has the longest title on the slide here. Eric Berger is the director of the Georgetown Center for Secure Communications, the GCSC, and also the Security and Software Engineering Research Center. Eric, the fun fact about Eric is that both he and his brother Jim Berger have done amazing things that you haven't heard of that have made the internet better. Eric previously was the CTO at Newstar, which runs a lot of the domain name system. His brother Jim was a lawyer, worked for Apple back in the 90s, and played a key role in leading the effort to get the FCC to adopt the Wi-Fi standard. So these two brothers have done amazing things, and they can argue about who's smarter and who's richer, but I just thank God we have both of them. So, Eric?
My brother is smarter and richer.
But you have a PhD.
But I have a PhD. Well, he's an LLD, right? Yeah. So one thing that we've been talking about so far is damage to American companies, damage to American interests, damage to American startups. We do have to remember that it wasn't just the NSA. GCHQ is involved a lot. Now, you might argue that Russians, Chinese, and British citizens probably have no expectations of privacy. They have cameras everywhere. But the Australians were pretty upset when they found out how much their government was spying and trading on themselves and all that. And so and you did kind of cover it. It's not just American industry and American business, but it's global industry, and something that was just announced today, very much of interest to the internet. What was announced today, the Internet Society, and that's the other disclaimer or longer title. I am a trustee of the Internet Society. We just released 5 principles of cybersecurity today. And this is not just a technology thing, but a policy thing, because if you think about it, what is the role of government? The role of government is to protect its citizens. It's very important to improve commerce, because that makes your citizens better, but it's also to protect your citizens. So countries have a real legitimate interest in looking at security, but we want to do it in ways that don't, cook the goose while we're protecting our citizens or, doing things for what we think are the right reasons. So being the lone technologist on the panel, I will talk a little bit about some technologies, because some of the things that we do at Georgetown is we invent new stuff, and one of the things is actually we don't trust anybody. If you look at the business model of the high security cloud computing vendors, how do you know that it's really high security and you can put your high security data in it? Some are selling to the government. It's because they promise you that it's really high security. So we're working on the complex mathematics to make it so they never see the data. They never see the program. You send a program up to them to run against your data, but if they look at the program, they go, oh, I can't tell what this is. You send scrambled data up to it, scrambled data comes out. They have no idea what it's about. That's, real trust. Now, this is university research, so on a supercomputer we can get Intel 46 class computing, but in some certain targeted areas we actually have reasonable costs of delivering this kind of technology and this kind of computing. We're also looking at mathematical ways of, for example, having data that you can still sort. Your blood pressure might be 140, my blood pressure might be 120. We don't want to let the blood pressure numbers out, but you're 1 million, I'm 900,000. You don't know what the values are, but you can say, yeah, you're more than me. And you can still have some interesting computation and basically calculate how much information am I going to leak out. So that's some of the stuff we're working on the technology side. Also, a lot of it is, looking at old stuff and either saying this is why it works, or this is why it really, you thought it would work, it doesn't work. And thing that has been hashed over and over again is like how we do certificates. How do we know who you are on the internet? And even there's some really interesting developments. Estonia just today, they'd announced it, but now you can actually do it. You can go to the Estonian embassy and get an e-residency card. Now you might think, oh, that's kind of cool for the Estonians. It's obvious this is going to help them with their commerce because you get one of these e-Estonia cards, you can now open a bank account in Estonia. Oh, they get some of your money. You can buy property in Estonia. You can invest in a company in Estonia. But it has much more implications than just that, because one of the things that, our government with the National Assured Identities and
NSTIC.
NSTIC, thank you, is in a country where we don't have a national identity card, how can you do identity? Well, actually, if you got one of these things from Estonia, it's a vouched for, validated identity. What does that mean for trust and identity on the internet? So with that, that's enough of some technology stuff. I'm sure we're going to get back to more on how we can solve all your problems with just an infinite amount of computing power. And I'll pass it on.
And the right encryption.
That's right.
The right code. Our last speaker is Adam Schlosser. He's the director for the Center of Global Regulatory Cooperation at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he's going to cover everything we haven't covered already.
Which isn't much, so that's the disadvantage of going last. A lot of what I was going to cover has been already talked about and probably better than I was going to say it anyway, so thank you all very much. And thank you, Jake, for that new favorite blog. I'm actually really looking forward to that. So I'm with the U.S. Chamber of...
You would have gotten the award for best dressed, but he's got the socks.
He consistently has great socks. So I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Many of you have heard of us before. We're the world's largest business association. We represent the interests of over 3 million businesses, organizations, and regional chambers around the world. So that includes everything from the big tech companies you think of, Microsoft, Google, on down the line to the one-person mom-and-pop shops down in Des Moines, Iowa. And one of the things we try to do is build bridges between startups, between young companies with multinationals, and multinationals in the tech sector, and multinationals across other sectors that you wouldn't think are involved in technology, but very much are. So banks and credit cards and manufacturers, Nowadays, a car company is thought of as a tech company, essentially. It's just one big roving computer. And all these companies have similar concerns about trust, about privacy, about security that startups do. So it's important to build those bridges and connect those messages for a lot of reasons. One is that when you have a common voice, it's much louder. And secondly, when you're talking to governments around the world, they hear from a lot of big American companies and they frankly don't necessarily care. But they do care about their domestic startups. They do want to hear from startups around the world because everyone loves innovation. Startups are sexy. So what you say matters. You can change the course of dialogue and the course of policy around the world. 95% of the consumers around the world are located outside the United States. You put up your app, you put up your new store online, and the next day you could be selling to Peru, to China, to Australia, all over, and you go to sleep and that wasn't the case. So it's really important to be able to ensure the internet remains connected and that it's a global network. And Danielle already talked about the trend towards segmenting the internet and having a Schengen cloud in Europe or having a Chinese-only cloud in addition to the Great Firewall. There's all sorts of trends out there that are very problematic for startups in that when you're acquiring these new customers, you can't afford to build a server in every country around the world. So it's important to bake trust into your products, into your services from the very beginning. We talked a little bit about the NSA. One of the things we do is try to educate foreign governments around the world. So it's sort of a misguided thought to say that if we have servers in our country, then the NSA can't get there. I mean, there's probably more oversight in the United States. And secondly, where do you trust your data? Where do you trust your IP more, in the United States or in Russia? So there's a lot of education that can be done out there. And also want to talk a little bit about consumer expectations. So we talk about building digital trust and building trust overall, and it's important. But one of the tough things is how do you do it when the consumers, the end users, don't know what they want? If you go to the average person on the street and you say, tell me all the groceries you bought the last 2 weeks, people look at you and say, no, get away from me. I'm not going to tell you that. But if you give them a card and say, you'll get 5% off every month if you let us track all your purchases, people do that in droves. So how do you build your product when the expectations, the consumers themselves don't know what they want? There was a really interesting study done recently where a woman was in, I think, New York City, and she was giving people physical, actual baked cookies for their social security numbers, and people were doing it. So it wasn't even cookies on a computer. It was just a big demonstration that people really don't know what
Were
they
they good cookies?
I think they were oatmeal chocolate chips, so I don't know.
Well, if they're oatmeal, I mean.
Yeah, there was also a recent study done that showed in the wake of the NSA revelations that about 50% of the general public was concerned about government spying and surveillance. So the follow-up question was, and then what have you done about it? And 15% or so said, oh, we changed a password. We added a number to our password. And then less than 1% said, oh, we changed email servers or we changed our online browsing habits. So when it's always in the news and the U.S. is talking about it and Europe's talking about it and around the world people are talking about spying and building trust, but then that's not reflected in how people purchase, how people use the internet, it's really tough to decide or tough to build trust or know how to best do that. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about some of these tough issues, talk about privacy. And actually, just real quick, security is another important topic, and it's currently being talked about a lot in the U.S. Congress. The NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has a new framework out on best practices around cybersecurity. And one of the things we try to do with policymakers around the world is educate them that if you're going to put new policies in place, you're going to put new laws, make sure that it's around best practices and it's flexible. So you're not saying, here's your cybersecurity rules you all have to follow. So then in addition to what the companies have to follow, all the bad guys are saying, okay, there's our target, there's our target, there's our target. So a lot going on in the policy space that's going to be important to startups and young businesses around the world.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Just as I expected, we got 4 different views and filled in a lot of the pieces of the puzzle. One of the things, though, I want to do as a part-time professor at Georgetown is I want to get a reading list for people who are in this area. So I hope that each of you can give at least one thing that someone worried about trust in the global marketplace should go and read. I think Eric's already done it. He mentioned a brand new report out just today from the Internet Society. It's called Collaborative Security, and you can go online and read some of the things that need to be addressed if we're going to build the trusted Internet around the world. My favorite line in that is that, quote, "People are what ultimately hold the Internet together." And that's where we have to start. Obviously, we need people doing the right thing, working together to do the right thing. So let's start there. If I'm a startup, I've got a global startup. I've got 2 developers in India. I've got 3 developers in Ukraine. I've got a marketing guy out in the valley. I've got a team in designing my web interface up in New York. What do I do? I mean, I've got all these different markets, 70 companies I might sell to. How do I get my hands around the problems that could hit me between the eyes? What resources can I go look at today?
So I've got 2, one that will scare you and one that will make you feel better. So I'll do the one that will scare you first. And go read, not a particular publication, but anything that's been in the news recently about China's recent moves to both require local companies to provide technology services and also to make them give up their source code and put backdoors in the technologies. This is the dystopian future of the internet for those countries that are looking to pursue it. And China's not the only one that's moving in that direction, and so I would just encourage you to look at that if you haven't already. On the positive side, I would take a look at the work that eBay has done on what they call Commerce 3.0, which is a series of publications where they've gone out and surveyed their users of their platform and also put kind of a policy gloss on some of the search and trust tools that I've been talking about here. It's really well done, and they're one of the only companies out there that actually reaches into their user base to come up with real data.
Okay. Anybody else have a reading assignment?
Go ahead. I already got one, but I'll put another one on.
Okay.
You get yours first.
I mean, I would say one thing that that I think companies need to do a lot earlier, and I think it's part of what we talked about, which is think about security and think about how you're going to get your customers to trust you, and think about inevitably when you're going to find a vulnerability or when there's going to be a data breach or something's going to happen, because technology is made by humans, code is written by humans, there's always flaws in it, there are always problems, unexpected things always happen, and you need to plan for that. And so I would congratulate you on how many developers you have in your small startup, by the way. I was very impressive, but you want to be thinking about that. And there was actually, this is not my main reading list item, but I saw this, there was a recent study that came out that looked at big companies, a lot of them Fortune 500 companies that are building mobile apps, and whether they're testing their products before they put them out and whether they're spending any money on security. It's like 40% of these apps are never really tested before they go out into the world, and half of the companies spend absolutely no money directly on security on these products.
These
and
aren't all just
big.
startups. These are big
These
companies
are not just
building
startups. These
little
are big companies
building apps.
too.
Yeah.
And so the problem is with that is that, you know, I think there was a long time, for a long time, people sort of, and maybe it's not, I don't want to overgeneralize here, but people sort of said the internet is risky, you know, breaches might happen. I know that it's always a little bit insecure, and that's okay because I want to participate in this. And what we're seeing now is that people do care about security. It's important, and you don't want to be caught scrambling to figure it out after a major data breach. Those are incredibly costly for companies. For a startup, a major data breach or security vulnerability can be deadly. And it's gonna be really hard to win back the trust of your customers if they find out you didn't actually test the product or spend any money on it. So I think that's something that is maybe not thought about when you're thinking about how to build it and how to roll out new features. It's not as exciting for a lot of people. It's invisible a lot of the time to people, but it's incredibly important.
Eric, you had another?
Yeah, so the specific thing to look at, and there are actually 2. One is the SANS 20, because here's the deal. It's a lot easier to say, oh, I'm going to make sure my code's written right, and it's like a small increment on what you would have done if you just hacked at it, as opposed to you hacked at it, you put it out there, oh my goodness, I've got a breach. Not only is there the reputational damage, it's a lot more expensive to fix the code that's already been written. And the other is to actually look at the framework. Now, the NIST framework doesn't really say anything. It's a framework, but one of the appendices is about 8 times longer than the framework itself. It's all the references, and there are, again, a lot of good references that you would hand off to your developer people saying, are we doing this stuff? What are we doing in here? Have you thought about it? One out of your huge team may have heard of it and will evangelize to the other ones and the person who's doing the money. And that's what's going to start happening, because you've got really intrusive ways of doing it. Because you could say, the Chinese are trying to be helpful. Give us the source code and we'll have our experts look at it and make sure that it's secure, except for where we need a little hole. But they're actually, in all seriousness, there is probably an element of they want their stuff to be secure as well. Or, hey, let the market decide. So I'll put in the plug for the favorite agency that everyone loves to hate, Department of Homeland Security. Yes, TSA, boo. Science and technology, actually not that bad. They've funded a lot of open source software engineering tools that people can use, more in the startup world, but basically out there, all open source. Run your code at it. You'll be appalled at what it'll find, but fix it and you'll be better off for it in the long run.
Okay. Adam, do you have any reading lists, any websites?
So I was going to mention the framework, but again, going last got co-opted. So I will give everyone a fun fact instead. How about that?
There we go. That's right.
So we recently staged a live data breach exercise. We brought in a compliance attorney, someone from the FBI, and a forensic consultant from a big consultant firm to talk about what do you do in the event of a breach? How do you handle it from a public relations standpoint, from a compliance standpoint? How do you deal with it internally and externally? So one of the interesting facts that came up is the FBI, they can spot when you have an intruder on your networks, whether it's dormant or not, they can spot that in advance. And if you have lines of communication with them, you can talk and they can tell you, hey, look out for this new network. And there's a safe harbor there where as long as you have best practices in place and you work to mitigate it, you're not going to be fined or be found in violation of any laws. So they said that on average, the foreign nations that are attacking networks, it's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, they're on the network for anywhere from, on average, I think it's about 265 days before they're discovered, and they're just dormant, and they're just waiting there. And what they'll do is they'll learn when you send the most data. So if it's a financial services company or it's a payments company, it's when the market's open. So they'll wait, and then they'll start activating their source at 9 a.m. when the market's open, so you can't detect it. But the longest time a nation state was present on a major multinational company's network was 6 years before discovery.
6 years.
Yeah. So.
And they have no idea what they got in that time, I'm sure. Yeah.
Nope.
A specific question for you. You work with a lot of small companies. We've started to see more and more of these small companies being held hostage. They're either have their systems infected by ransomware, or they're attacked by massive DDoS attacks. You can rent botnets now by the hour if you want, so you don't have to be very sophisticated to bring down some small website. This is happening over and over and over again. Thousands of times a day, people are finding themselves being held hostage. Are you seeing those complaints as well? Are people coming to you and saying, I got a ransom note from Moldova, what do I do?
You know, they don't necessarily come to me with those issues. They come to me when the government says you have to build a new server for $1 million or else. So when they're being held hostage by their own domestic governments is when we go to bat for them more so than the spear phishing or the other attacks like that.
Has anybody else seen this problem? And I'm just curious, because this is a serious problem for startups, and it's growing because it's very lucrative. You know, even if you're only getting $100 a month, multiply that by 1,000, you have a pretty good income. Okay, two things that I wanted to mention real quick. I don't necessarily want you to read this report, but there was a very interesting report that came across my desk. You can read it if you're an economist. One of my favorite economists is Johannes Bauer. He's at Michigan State University, and he just published a ECIPE working paper on the damage done by data localization.
European Center for Information and Political Economy.
Right. It's a great report. And it looked at this problem that you were talking about, the policies that are going to try to subdivide the internet and subdivide the cloud. He looked at about 6 or 7 different countries and the proposals that they're presently considering to wall off their part of cyberspace. And the damage that he estimated would be done in these cases was somewhere between 2% and 7% of the GDP of these countries. Because by walling yourself off, you're blocking the ability of your citizens to take part in the most exciting new applications that are being developed for the global market. And you're also hurting your own startups who aren't going to be as in a good position to be part of the global economy. So if you need a few factoids, a few good arguments about why data localization is bad, that's a place to look. But let me ask a question on that issue. I mean, how have you advised your clients on this issue? I mean, what are they doing when they're faced with the Chinese telling them you have to build for the Chinese market?
Well, you have the rest of the world, you have China, and you have Russia.
Right.
So the majority of the world, the economic argument has an impact, and they really want to develop their local economy. They really want to develop their startups and their tech companies. So it's important, like I said, to build those bridges, to work with them, to show that the same things that your domestic startup cares about, the same thing that the large social media companies care about. And one of the things that we bring up, in addition to privacy and security, is investment flows and assuring that there's an easy flow of capital and a safe flow of capital across different jurisdictions. So in some nations, Southeast Asia, other places, they require the use of local banks in order to transfer funds. They have investment caps, so private equity companies or venture capitalists don't want to invest in startups where they can't set the rate of ownership. So that's another issue out there that we talk about and we work on. And when we explain to foreign governments that you have issues with servers, you have issues with investment, and this is why your economy might not be as advanced as it could be, they tend to listen. And that's one of the ways that we advance the issue.
So Jake, do you have a comment on this, or do you?
Unless you're going to ask something else.
I have another question for you, unless you have a.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm going to change topics entirely, so if you want to, okay. Well, this is trade season here in Washington, and I was up at the White House last week, and they were explaining that they're going all in on Trade Promotion Authority. They have these big trade agreements with Asia and with Europe that they're really pushing for. Hidden inside those agreements are some provisions on the digital economy, and one hope is that those agreements can push back against any data localization efforts. Is this going to happen? Are we actually going to see trade agreements that deal with the digital economy? And
So my answer was going to be the same to the previous question anyway, so this is helpful. So yes, I mean, I think we're paid to be optimists, so take
if
this
you're in
with a
the
grain
trade arena, you have to be optimistic.
That's right.
Yes,
That's right.
and patient.
Otherwise, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. But no, I think we are going to see the trade agreements come through, and there's a process for doing this, right? And so up on the Hill right now, they're debating the merits of Trade Promotion Authority, which is the underlying authority that Congress gives the president in order to negotiate these trade agreements that are, frankly, already being negotiated. But that's likely to progress in the next several months, if not weeks. And then concurrent with that, you'll have a process by which I hope the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations are advanced and I hope concluded over the next several months. And that's the Asia agreement that you were talking about that involves a number of nations, United States, Canada, Chile, Singapore, others. And so those are the first two things on the horizon. I think what I was going to say in answer to your previous question is that what I think you're moving towards is a world where you're going to have countries that get it and have a constellation of policies that support entrepreneurship and engagement in the global economy, and then a hopefully smaller constellation, a hopefully smaller group of countries that are moving in the wrong direction on a whole set of policies. And so I would right now put certainly Russia, Argentina in the latter category. But I would put a country like Chile or Great Britain or us in the United States in the first category. And so what I hope is over time you have more of these policies, more of these trade agreements that affirmatively permit flows of data to happen, prohibit localization requirements, prohibit requiring countries to require companies to have a server built in their country as a condition of doing business, and also do other things. I mean, one of the things that we talk a great deal about is the effective protection of intellectual property rights and the right frameworks for the 21st century. And so there are things that get more difficult as you go online, like the protection of trade secrets, which are now subject to theft by cyber criminals online, right? But at the same time, you need to permit the digital economy to function. And if you have overly prescriptive IP rules that do not appropriately protect intermediaries, platforms like Google, like eBay, you're not going to have an effective internet.
Yeah. Okay, so Eric has a rebuttal.
Yeah, so, because it struck me in the opening as well. So have the provisions that would have basically codified things like SOPA and PIPA, basically hacking the DNS, that was part of TPP and all that. Is that been pushed out now?
So that was never part of TPP. What TPP and what the European agreement, TTIP, do, they essentially, they attempt to, well, what they do is they hew to U.S. law. And so it's the same balance of rights, limitations, exceptions, and obligations that currently exists in U.S. law, is what the U.S. is aiming to achieve. And I am very confident that they would not accept anything that went beyond that.
This has been a worry by our company as well, and we're getting the assurances we need on this one. So I'm going to turn to the encryption issue. You both mentioned encryption. When you mentioned how encryption makes your eyes glaze over, I thought...
Well, it doesn't make mine.
It doesn't, mine
I
either.
I love it, but
yeah,
not normal,
my heart goes pitter-patter, but it's because of anxiety. I was in the White House in the Clinton administration in the first crypto wars, so I have a lot of rather unpleasant memories of trying to defend key escrow and Clipper chip and all the rest. So the question is, we've been hearing about the golden key, magic encryption that provides really strong encryption unless the FBI or the NSA or somebody gets the authorization and needs to get at it. Tell us if the golden key can work.
It's so easy I can let my taxi drivers answer that. No. So I was there, you were there, when we had the great Yahoo Admiral Rogers exchange.
This was a conference in January over at the Reagan
Was
Building.
it one of theirs?
It was a New America conference.
It was one of
yeah.
yours.
Yes, it was.
That's right.
It was a damn
So
good,
put in the picture.
damn good conference.
And it was a great conference. That's
I
right.
can't remember the hashtag though.
That's right.
But you can watch it all
Not
online.
good, but the
That's
hashtag was not good. The conference was one.
That's right.
Didn't
So,
say
is it, and in fact, the guy in the office next to me does the impossible. He does these impossibility proofs, which are usually, that's like the end of an academic career because you can't. So far, no one has proved that it's impossible to have an algorithm that really works that has a golden key. So no one's proved it. However, to date, no one's found one. And logically, you look at it and say, this is just not going to work. And it did get to so we're building a backdoor for the US government, you're also building a backdoor for China and Russia. And pick out your favorite terrorist organization or whatnot. And at the same time, you're eroding trust in the internet. We can't trust that our credit card numbers are going to be safe. It's not just whether my lunch, because of course my lunch plans are going to be of extreme interest to the authorities for whom I'm going to be having lunch with. But my credit card numbers, my bank statements, my health care records, and so on. So to date, I mean, maybe they do have something special we haven't figured out yet up at the fort, but so far we haven't seen it.
No evidence.
So one thing I will say I'm going to add to the reading list now, but it's relatively short, which was after at the New America Cybersecurity Conference when Alex Stamos, who's the chief information officer at Yahoo, sort of challenged Admiral Rogers on this on stage, and Admiral Rogers said, well, he kind of implied, I've got some guys that tell me that it's possible to have strong encryption with backdoors that nobody else can access. And so a guy, so Julian Sanchez, who at the Cato Institute wrote the next day about sort of what he may have been talking about in terms of asymmetric backdoors and sort of the theoretical reason why it might be possible, why there isn't necessarily someone saying it's impossible, but there are no cryptographers publicly saying it's possible to do this. And it's as you build more and more complex systems and you're dealing with security and you're dealing with humans who are building these systems, the idea of coming up with a way to have strong encryption with a backdoor that works and that people trust is is just, it's still an elusive concept. I think the golden key terminology is very apt in that sense, that it sounds like something that's mythical and not real. And I think that beyond the sort of question of like, is it in theory maybe possible somehow to do this? What happened in the 90s, and that debate that makes your heart rate elevate, Mike, and what we're starting to talk about again today, is the question of even if it was possible, is it effective? Would people trust it? Would it diminish people's trust in these technologies overall? How do you determine who holds the keys, and how do you determine the security of the key holders? So this question of, if you make a secure key and then someone has to hold it so that law enforcement can go to them with a warrant and say, give us access, how do you protect the security of the key holder? And then, and how do you say if a foreign government comes to the US government, how do you determine whether or not you give them access? So like the additional questions that come out of this, and the question of whether it's effective, and whether there aren't better ways in an age where there is so much data available about where people are going, what they're doing, who they associate with. And so the question of the sort of idea that encryption means that law enforcement is going dark, that it's harder for them to get information. There's a lot of people who flip it on their head and say, we actually live in a golden age of surveillance. There is so much information out there that you can get in so many other ways that you don't need to break encryption or push for back doors in order to carry out your intelligence and your law enforcement mission. And I think that's a pretty important point.
And realistically, how is encryption broken today? It's typically not from supercomputers trying to find big primes. It's typically not from golden keys and great backdoors. It's either the rubber hose key extraction method, or we have bugs, like old-fashioned bugs, and see what's in the clear text on the machine. So as long as there are those kinds of vulnerabilities, it kind of doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. If encryption makes your heart go pitter-patter and you care a lot about cybersecurity, you might want to hold the date. May 18th, the Internet Society is hosting an event with Bruce Schneier and Chris Riley from Mozilla. It's going to be at George Washington University. So put that in your calendar, and May 18th should be a great event. And then in June, or perhaps in July, we're having our annual Internet Governance Forum USA, which the Internet Society is helping organize. And that will, I guarantee you, have at least one session on encryption and a lot of discussion about these issues around data localization. So we're still organizing that. If you're interested, talk to me, talk to Paul Brigner, talk to Judith Hillerstein. We're still, and Shane, all of us are involved in the organizing committee. And we're very happy to, we're happy to have help here. Okay, so one more comment about golden keys?
No, none about that. I don't know anything about that.
Well, here, then you can talk about
But you've been sitting here as moderator, but it strikes me that you're probably the person here with the most direct experience in the post-Snowden world about trying to build trust at a company. I mean, could you just maybe talk a little bit about your experience and what Cloudflare has faced as it tries to build trust?
This is why I have the microphone. I'm the moderator here, but
I already told you I was going to do this.
Happy to talk about Cloudflare. Some of you probably heard of Cloudflare. It provides a service that will protect your website against DDoS attacks. We have the record for defeating the largest DDoS attack in history. I'll tell you the details later, but it was literally hundreds of billions of web requests hammering away at this one website, which we were able to deflect using our data centers around the world. We've built this trusted infrastructure, which is operating in about 15 different countries. We not only provide protection against DDoS attacks, we're also providing SSL encryption for free to all of our customers. But the challenges are real. We are really worried about the idea that countries will start saying that data has to stay inside their borders. We've built a global cloud. The whole idea is that we can balance the load of traffic going to your website. If we can't deflect traffic back and forth, if we can't move your data from one of our data centers to another in order to serve that data more effectively to your customers, we lose huge efficiencies, great increase in complexity, and it decreases the reliability of the whole system. So one of the reasons Cloudflare, which has 150 people, just hired 2 public policy experts, myself and Heather West, to work on public policy around the world is because we are seeing these real challenges as governments are going forward with some simple-minded solutions to problems that are real problems. The solutions are not real solutions. These solutions that would subdivide the internet and somehow keep data inside one country or one region, it's not going to work. Likewise, we're very concerned about some of the proposals on cybersecurity that would tell companies like Cloudflare that they have to use a certain set of technologies. And this is what we see in China, where they're starting to impose standards which may provide some security, but not enough security. So a lot of interesting challenges for Cloudflare. And luckily, we're plugged into groups like the Internet Society and the Internet Engineering Task Force, and working with a number of the peering organizations to find solutions to some of these challenges so that governments don't have to come up with the regulatory solutions. But thank you for asking. I'm now going to start pulling people in the audience into the discussion, and I'm going to start by imposing on Andrea Glorioso to give us a European perspective. We're all from this side of the Atlantic, but Andrea just joined us here in Washington last year prior to becoming the counsel in charge of digital economy issues at the European Union delegation here in Washington. He was handling digital issues in Brussels. So unlike some diplomats, he comes incredibly well prepared for his job. A diplomat is usually somebody who knows how to answer any question diplomatically and learn very fast on the job. Andrea already knows. I was going to do my thing, so there we go.
Thank you.
Let's just see if any more questions.
The exchange of microphone is a sign of peace. But
That's the one with the bug in it.
you want me to sit there or? Yeah. So I'll not give my shoulders. So thanks, Mike. And before I give what you call as the European perspective, which I wouldn't even know what it is. Actually, Europe is a large continent with different member states and different opinions. But let me just share with you the fact that I am extremely happy to see this discussion, and I thank the panelists for being here. One thing that you might not be aware of is that actually the EU delegation has helped organize this meeting. The idea of this event came to myself and to David Viers, who unfortunately cannot be here. When we had a lunch some months ago, but now some weeks ago, we were talking about life, universe, and all the kind of stuff we talk at lunch. And I have myself been speaking at a lot of ISOC DC events, which are all great, and ISOC DC is really great at organizing all this stuff. And most of those events were focusing on public policy and internet governance and all these things that I have been doing for a job and I still do. And I kind of told David, no, I get bored to discuss these things. And I don't think they're that interesting at the end of the day for the business community, for the startup community. So can we try and organize something that would have, on the one hand, the public policy dimension and trust in cybersecurity and all the stuff. Of course, it has a huge public policy importance. But also that would really talk to the people that are creating this technology, that are doing business, that are growing the economy. Believe me, I mean, neither the US government or the European Commission are making the economy grow, quite frankly. We can create the policy that will facilitate other people and companies to do that. The reason why you don't see the logo of the European Union there is twofold. A, because I thought it would scare the people that I wanted to be in the room. And secondly, because I originally thought, yeah, it would be a good idea to put the flag there. And then I thought how much paperwork would be necessary to put the bloody flag there. And I thought my time would be better spent in funner things like banging my head against a corner of the table. And I thought, okay, look, we're not going to put the flag there, but I want to recognize the great work of Jesse Spector, my colleague who is sitting there, who basically did all the preparatory work on our side. I did what I do best. I had the idea, and then I let someone else work on it. Now, on the European perspective, I'm here because I want to listen, quite frankly, to the perspective of the business and startup community here. I think one of the greatest difficulty, if you work in public policy, whether in government, especially in government, is actually to understand what are the real problems. Because frankly, you get to deal with so many lobbyists, which is fine. I mean, it's part of the work, and companies hire lobbyists to tell us what is wrong, what is right, what is the problem. But sometimes the companies which are most innovative in this space, they actually don't have lobbyists. They do not know how to reach out to governments and explain to us what the real problems are. So part of the reason why we have this meeting is because I wanted, and not only I, but we thought it would be a good idea to have this kind of gathering to understand what the real issues are. And one of the issues, for me at least, is, and I get to the European perspective, I think what is really important is to keep in mind that there are concerns which are real concerns in the sense that what happened here in the US with the so-called Snowden revelations, which is a term I don't like very much, and I will not comment on that because it's not my job to do that, but it did have an impact in the way in which Europe perceived the cooperation with the US. On the other hand, some of the ideas, they are not laws, I want to stress that, but there have been ideas and discussions in Europe about how do you handle with the lack of trust, with security, with insecurity, which is perceived as coming from one of your all-time allies. And there have been proposals from industry and from certain national politicians about Schengen clouds and national routing and all this kind of stuff. One thing I want to say, and I want it to be on record, none of this is the law in Europe. Neither in Europe nor in any of the member states. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's very easy to scream at each other. It's very easy to not listen to one another. The US has certain intelligence policies because the government and the democratically elected government and Congress thought that it would be a good idea to have them. It's not up to me to decide whether that's right or wrong. It's up to the US citizens to take the decision. Europe is having certain discussion because our democratically elected politicians think that perhaps a solution to the insecurity and lack of trust that we see might be one of those Schengen cloud ideas. I will not tell you whether I agree with that or not. I think you can reach your own conclusion.
The body language is pretty
Yeah, the body language is pretty clear. I'm Italian. I've always been told my body language is really not a good diplomatic body language. But what is really important, and what I hope this kind of meeting might be a good start of, is we should really talk to one another and understand what our concerns are. Because even if some of the solutions that are being proposed, as you said yourself, Mike, some of the solutions might not make a lot of sense, that doesn't discount the reality of the problems underlying it. The NSA, the intelligence and the security organizations and agencies here in the US are very right when they say, you know, the world is not a nice place and we need to protect our citizens, and likewise in Europe. Europe is very right, and Europeans are very right in saying we have certain laws on privacy, we have a right to see those applied. In order to find common solutions, we need to talk to one another, and in order to understand what is good for business, we need to talk to business, which is part of the reason why we're here. And very last point, a lot of countries besides Europe and big countries on the east of Europe or on the very far east of Europe have been mentioned by the panel. I would really like to underline that at the end of the day, let's keep in mind that Europe and the USA have a lot more in common, really a lot more in common than either of the two has with those big countries on the east. Every time, and I see this in my job daily, every time Europe and the US squabble over issues that perhaps can be addressed in a more cooperative fashion, including on blind trust, on privacy, on cybersecurity, believe me, there are people in those countries that are clapping their hands. They're taking the popcorn, they're sitting and they're watching the show, because anything on which US and Europe does not agree is a space for those countries to get in. And the policy of those countries is not something that either in Europe or in the US we want. With this, I will stop here. Thanks, Mike, for helping organize this.
I've got a question for you. So you don't get away that easy. It has been interesting to hear both the Prime Minister of the UK and certain officials in France talk about something that sounds a lot like the Golden Key. But I'm not going to ask you about that. Instead, I want to ask you what you hear when you talk to European digital startups, and what concerns do they have about going global? What is first of mind? What makes them hire lawyers? What keeps them awake at night? And it doesn't have to be the US.
Yeah, no, actually it's not, because what many European startups they want to do is to actually work a lot with the US, because the US is a great market. I mean, if you're a small startup, what usually is the habit is you come to the US, normally Silicon Valley, but there are also other clusters in the US. You grow very fast, and then what we have seen is that most of the time actually European startups, they keep their research and development branch in Europe. It's cheaper, quite frankly, and we have great brains in Europe, and they move part of their headquarters to the US. In terms of why, so frankly, I don't see any difficulty, or I don't see cooperation with the US as a problem for European startups. To the contrary, it's an opportunity for them, and as far as the European Commission is concerned, we're very happy about that, and we would like to promote that. Let me also mention that, I mean, we are thinking, we're starting to work on a conference, on an event in Silicon Valley in September. The working title is Startup Europe to Silicon Valley or something like that, but I'm very bad at titles, so I don't know what will be the result. But it is exactly to make sure that we have, that we can bring a number of startups from Europe to Silicon Valley and exchange ideas. And make them see, many European startups are already in Silicon Valley, but we want to make this more structured than it currently is. In terms of what keeps European startups awake at night, I don't think there are very different problems than what keeps US startups awake at night. So it's an issue of getting funding, getting capital, which in Europe is perhaps a little more difficult than in Silicon Valley. The whole system is more fragmented. Privacy and security are two very big issues. I don't remember which one of the panelists mentioned it, but it is a reality that the internet has become, when you want to operate in a global marketplace, you get a lot of security worries, because especially when you're small, one data breach is enough to kill you, basically, and you don't have the money, you don't have the resources, you don't have the media coverage, you don't have the media capacity in order to withstand that kind of problem. And the very last thing that, as far as European startups tell us, but this is very European, so I'm not sure how interesting it can be for the public here, is the fact that, I mean, let's recognize it from many points of view. Europe has a single market in many areas, but when it comes to the so-called digital single market, there is still a major fragmentation in Europe, which is something that the European Commission, which is the organization I work for, is aiming to address with a proposal that will come up in May this year.
That's another thing to read if you're interested in the European digital market. They've just put out this new plan for the digital market. Okay, it's your turn. Anybody put their hand up? Any questions for our panelists? All the way back there. And you have to introduce yourself and say your name. Well, you're famous.
Hi, Peter Dengate Thrush. I'm a recovering IP lawyer. I just wanted to pick up on a comment that I think that Adam made, which was that the consumers aren't, being very helpful. And I want to suggest that's the wrong approach. Consumers are never going to know what the answer is. The consumers didn't want fluoride in the water, they didn't want seat belts in their cars, and they probably didn't want an iPhone. And innovation sort of doesn't work that way. I think, the quote about Henry Ford was, if consumers had been asked, they would have asked for a horse that ran at 35 miles an hour. So the question really is then who has to do this? And it's a question that has to be dealt with by the hardware manufacturers, the software manufacturers, the academics feeding into both of those, civil society groups like this. And the real question is what proportion should that be done by, I guess? Is there anybody missing from that mix? And what's the role of government in legislating for this? Should hardware manufacturers be told they cannot sell equipment that has technical features? So I'd like a panel response. Thank you very much for all that you've said so far. It's been fantastic. But we need something else that's going to change this. It's not going to come from consumers. So where else can it come from?
And if I can make the question even more complicated, I'll point out that encryption and a lot of cybersecurity products are a little bit like antibiotics. You have to trust that they work, and you don't find out that they didn't work until you're dead. So that makes it hard for the market to work. So
uplifting.
Anyway, how do we get this? How do we push people faster and harder towards a more secure, trustworthy infrastructure?
I'll take a couple cracks at this. So first, right now a lot of governments throughout the world do have requirements regarding privacy, regarding security. The trick is, are those written so they're flexible? Can they accommodate different uses of data? Can they accommodate different types of data? Do they accommodate best practices? So are they mandating that you have to do, as I mentioned earlier, just static criteria for your privacy, or can it be flexible to adjust over time as new technologies are created, as new data is being developed?
We're very upset with some of those lists because they're more than 5 years old, and Cloudflare is only 5 years old. So we're not on those lists.
And there's changes happening around the world right now. The one issue is that the changes are largely in response to, say, social media. And when people think of privacy, they think immediately of spam and pop-up ads, and they don't think that, this is how my bank information is going to be protected. When they think of data flows, they're thinking of surveillance. They're not thinking of, this is when I travel to Europe, I can use my credit card and it's seamless, and I don't think twice about it. So it's important for the companies to think progressively and bake in those best practices at the start to accommodate their different uses to assure their customers and end users. And the other piece that I just want to mention quickly is the real driver of this will be the venture capitalists, will be the multinational companies that are buying the startups. Those are the ones that are really going to drive this. And we've seen a trend now where a lot of multinationals, rather than dedicate $100 million to an R&D strategy to determine whether or not an idea might even be feasible, they'll buy 4 or 5 startups at maybe $1 million, maybe $200,000 a pop or some lower amount, and it'll be 1/10 of what they would have spent, but they already have ideas that are already in motion. And what they'll be doing is they'll be looking ahead of time at those startups to decide, have they been thinking about security throughout the process? Have they been thinking about privacy throughout the process? I was just out in Silicon Valley recently talking to some compliance attorneys there, compliance for privacy, and they said they advise their large multinationals, these Fortune 100 companies, before making a purchase, is there anyone in the room who is of legal drinking age? Because they want to make sure that someone's thinking of these tough issues. And there was another fun fact, there was a recent survey that showed that over 50% of the value of young companies is in their data and their algorithms and when it comes to e-commerce startups and it comes to companies with high levels of intangibles, it's 70% of their value is determined by what data they have and how they treat it. So that's what's something that's going to really drive the market, I think, forward.
Are there ideas on driving?
Yeah, well, so one of the things is what can governments do?
Not just governments.
No, it's one of the things. Yeah. For the most part, it's stay the you-know-what away. Because quite often when you get regulation, you're going to have regulation for that moment in time. Yeah. We could have had that moment in time in 1996. We'd probably have a very different internet than we have today. Even today, when we kind of think we know what we're doing, we actually know that we pretty much don't know what we're doing. And so again, regulation, and this is where kind of like you're talking about, the checklist is still probably counterproductive. We have consumer protection laws. We have fraud laws. We have common sense. If those are applied, then maybe we don't need this special, it's cyber, it's different.
What about how about security breach legislation? That's all about transparency. That's forcing companies to admit when they've made an error, when they haven't done the right thing.
Yeah, it was
which
like
tends to push people to do the right thing.
It was one of those, you mean Sarbanes-Oxley passed in 2000 what? That actually basically is the basis for a lot of data breach regulation. It was already there, we just didn't know it. You have to say what's material. Well, guess what? Today, a data breach is material. You must report it.
So Intuit is the chair of the Global Innovation Forum, and they have a saying that says, we want to make data that delights. And so what I think...
Excuse me.
Excuse me?
What did you say? I didn't...
We want data to delight.
Data to delight. Okay. I saw somebody from Intuit today talking about Tinder for small business, which sounded like a really interesting concept of delighting in all sorts of ways.
I have no comment, and I have no idea what you're talking about. But they want data that delights, and I think the role of government should be to enable these innovative experiences that, for example, use data while appropriately protecting privacy. And if you look at the United States and EU, they do this in different ways. The EU system is prescriptive and top-down, and there's a whole set of unified laws that deal with privacy. The United States is more of a patchwork of regulations and enforcement powers. But I think those in the United States I think we in the United States would argue that the outcome that we all want to achieve is the same. There are these wonderful new financial services out there, TransferWise, where you can transfer currencies, exchange currencies at a much lower rate than through traditional banks. Companies are using data in ways to make individuals creditworthy, to assess their creditworthiness in ways that they couldn't before. And so, you have either QuickBooks or Kiva.org, who we had a panel with a couple of weeks ago, that talked about how they're using good data sets in order to reassess creditworthiness and give people loans that wouldn't have been able to get them prior to the internet. And so, from my perspective, you want this innovation to happen. You want this to be able to unfold not only in the United States, but in Europe and across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. The fact is we have different regulations between our countries. that govern things like privacy and cybersecurity, but I would hope that we would continue to build bridges like the US-EU Safe Harbor Agreement that permits US and EU firms to transfer data back and forth that would allow this innovation to take place and not stifle it.
Danielle, do you have any thoughts on this?
So I would say I think a lot of I've already covered a lot of this. So I'll be brief. One thing that I think is important is that while regulation can be concerning, and I agree. I think the point that we should think about not what is happening right now, but where networks are going and where companies are going, and figure out how to come up with laws and regulations that protect not against just exactly what's happening at this moment, because that's where we run into problems a lot of the time. It doesn't mean that the great thing is that actually a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in the digital sphere, we have analogs historically. They're things that we have dealt with in our ordinary lives. They're just happening in greater volume and maybe more frequently online. And so thinking about how we can talk about what we've protected historically in the United States and how to make that apply online is, I think, incredibly important. And actually we'll sort of thinking about what are we concerned about? We're concerned about protecting privacy. We're concerned about security. We're concerned about equal access. We're concerned about discrimination. Those aren't like digital values. Those are just values that apply in the digital age. And so I think when you sort of try to think about it that way, it helps take a longer term view of all these things. That being said, sometimes things are different online, and I think some of our laws and sometimes the courts are recognizing that as well. A cell phone has far more personal data on it than maybe was ever available about people 100 years ago, so we have to think about the protections that apply to that. So there's a lot of challenging problems there. What I think is exciting also, though, is that regulation and what governments do a lot of times sets a floor. It's a minimum of what companies have to do and how you have to protect consumers, but companies can go much further than that, and they can compete on privacy and on security and on a lot of these issues and say that's actually going to be part of your business model. And so that's, I think, one of the things that's also really exciting now that we're seeing is, Yahoo wants to be your secure email provider now. Google wants to be your secure email provider. They want to figure out how to make end-to-end encryption easier, and that's also really positive, because when companies see that as part of their value add and they want to make it easier for consumers, that's when we start to see adoption of things that previously were only sort of like a necessity. So encryption was used for a long time in like bank transactions, your most sensitive transactions. Maybe we should be encrypting everything that we do. We're going to need the companies that build these tools to actually make that easier.
Yeah. We're starting to see companies offer bug bounties.
Yeah, exactly.
Challenging people to break their systems.
Right, make our systems more secure. Like,
right.
Help us do that. There's a business incentive.
Okay.
That's pretty exciting.
So Peter has set the bar very high. That was an outstanding question because it led to 4 outstanding answers. I think you were the next person here. And again, introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Richard Barnes. I run a big chunk of the security staff at Mozilla, and I'm also a contributor with the Let's Encrypt project that's just trying to do some of the stuff you're talking about. I wanted to tie a couple of threads together here, some of the stuff that Peter mentioned, and I want to use your $0 figure as a starting point, because I hear numbers like that, and I'm thinking, is that the wrong number? And I think actually in the long run, it's the right number. We want people to be spending $0 on security because we want that. If people have to spend money on security, it's a disincentive to doing security, right? So I think what the end-to-end stuff you're talking about, Let's Encrypt, a lot of these initiatives, and at Mozilla we think a lot about how we make the web as a whole a more secure environment by default. In its bones, by default, is automatically secure. If we can't get to that point, then it'll be an engineering failure, but it'll also be sort of an economic failure in that the security won't be an inherent part of what we do, and it'll impose this extra cost on what everybody does. So I think the challenge and a lot of the damage of these fragmentation issues that we see in terms of having different regulations, different requirements for security in different domains, is that it makes it harder to engineer those basic platforms and harder to build security into the basic platforms that are used uniformly on a global basis. You brought up issues that startups face doing business in 70 countries. You have 4 browsers right now that make up the web in every country, and each of those browsers is used everywhere. So when we build a security technology into a browser, it's got to work everywhere right off the bat. And if it's got to work differently in one country, well, screw them. We're not going to do what they say. We do things we I was at a conference talking about emergency services, and we had Skype guys there, and they said, guys, unless you agree on one way to do emergency services globally for voice over IP, we're just not going to do any of them. And it's the same applies in security. So if we have this fragmented regime and we can't build tools that work the same way across the internet, we're going to have a lot more cost, and it's going to be, and that cost means additional risk in the whole ecosystem.
Responses? Wholehearted agreement?
Yes.
Yes, I think I have wholehearted agreement from me as well.
How you doing? Trey Herder from GW. You guys all referenced some threats to the existing business model in terms of the global marketplace, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit about where or if you see that marketplace evolving. So there were some references to sort of peer-to-peer trust applications, this notion of blockchain, and also I think Dr. Berger, you referenced zero-knowledge services, so this idea that there are some potential applications for homomorphic encryption. So if this marketplace is going to change, what direction do you think that's heading in, and where do you see the sort of major trend going?
And tell me first so I can get on the IPO.
Yeah. So in actuality, and again, I loved your intro, thank you. So mentioned PayPal. And the thing is that, PayPal has, through a lot of work and over the years, earned our trust. And we say, I trust this thing, PayPal. And they basically, for all intents and purposes, are a big server in the sky, right? It's a company running their stuff. In theory, blockchain, NFK, basically ways of saying that everyone's got a little bit of information, no one knows what it is, but you get them all together, they can say, yeah, you're good, or no, you're not, and they don't even know that that's the question they're answering. And we've got the stuff where there's a real bad guy even has one of those machines trying to figure out, they can't figure it out. The problem is a marketing problem. You clearly will know, wow, that's going to be more secure than PayPal. But, is, Joe Random on the street going to know, oh, wait a minute, oh, you said that's like the way Bitcoin works? Aren't those the pornographers and the drug dealers? Now, how did video cassette and how did the internet work? I mean, maybe that is the way the path, because people say, oh, wow, it worked for them. Maybe it can work for me. If you guys can't break it and figure out what's going on, yeah, that's good. Or it doesn't have a brand name behind it. So that's not really a technology problem. It is more of a marketing and commerce problem. Maybe that's the next new hot startup.
It's also a bit of a business model problem. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's held back identity is nobody's figured out a way to get everybody using an identity system for free. Everybody wants to charge something for it.
Well, we do, but then we get creeped out because the natural provider for that is the government.
Yeah.
But then in the United States, we get creeped out about it. In Europe, not so much a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not a technologist, and by saying that mobile is the next big thing isn't anyone that anyone doesn't know in the room. But the one thing that I think ought to be of concern for public policy is the fact is where some of these new technologies are evolving the fastest are in places where people are using it just because the regulatory environment can't cope with it. And so we did a panel a couple of weeks ago where USAID's digital finance lead talked about how some of the places where mobile finance is getting fastest adoption is in the Congo. And that's not necessarily a good thing, right? I mean, it's getting traction there because because there's no regulatory environment to enforce anything surrounding it. I mean, I think what we've been talking about up here has been trying to craft flexible regulatory frameworks that allows innovation to happen, not no regulatory framework that allows anything to happen. And I think that's a challenge globally for policymakers.
Okay, front row.
Hi, Phil Corwin. I want to ask about a non-government, non-regulatory approach toward both protecting against economic loss from risk and driving practices that reduce risk. Traditionally, the way businesses protect themselves against risk was through commercial insurance, commercial insurers, which set standards. They'd even do research, underwriting laboratory led to much safer things for fire safety, which gets built in the standard. So if you have the insurer say, if the company to get a bank loan or to get VC funding has to be insured, if that becomes a standard, and to get the insurance you have to meet a certain basic standard, and if you get additional discounts, if you take additional steps towards cybersecurity for what you're doing, that's economic signals that drives the market. The fact is, right now in the commercial insurance market, the available policies are very expensive. They have holes in them. I tried to help a client understand a cyber insurance policy recently that he bought. It was 25 pages of contract and 38 pages of amendments and exclusions. It was a nightmare to understand.
Lots of billable hours.
Not that many. I'm a quick reader. And it had weird provisions, like if for his own data, company data, it protected it on his server, or if he hired an independent contractor to maintain his server, but the moment he put it on a cloud service, the insurance coverage disappeared. So that creates problems for other business models. So could commercial insurance standards play a part in driving industry towards safer cyber practice, and what do they need to get the database required to have more effective policies and more reasonable prices?
Yeah, so this actually was the great hope, or one of the great hopes coming out of the White House. And part of the drivers for the NIST framework was, we're going to have common standards, insurance companies would drive it, the marketplace would run it. The ironic thing, we had a workshop for economic incentives for cybersecurity. It's a conference that's been going on for many years now. It was held at Georgetown 2 years ago, or last year. And one of the interesting results was 10 years ago, when you applied for cyber insurance, you filled out like this 600-page questionnaire, and they'd come in and they'd audit you. And basically, it was so expensive to underwrite, no one bought insurance. Today, there's actually a lot of cyber insurance. It's pretty much, how much do you want to be insured for? This is how much it's going to cost. And oh, by the way, I have other lawyer friends as well who are like, but they're not insuring anything. I think now we're only starting to get the actuarial data. I think part of it is, again, it's not quite like fire code, where we've had 1,200 years of structures. We kind of know what works and what doesn't work. And in fact, we even today have issues with our building codes are so stuck in the 1940s that there are all these cool new building materials that we're not allowed to use. Imagine that in something that's going on as quickly as the internet, where is it a data breach because I was stupid, or is it a data breach because there was this really, really, really obscure thing in some far off corner that a foreign power got into? And it's really hard. Today, frankly, it looks the same.
Mm-hmm. Other comments on cyber insurance? One more reading assignment if you're interested in this topic. The Senate Commerce Committee had a hearing about a month and a half ago on cyber insurance, and I was very glad to see that. I think they have a distinction.
Treasury had a pretty good open session. It was one of their regular open session meetings.
Yeah, so it's getting attention. We don't have the answer yet, but it's getting attention. Other questions? No? Okay. No? Other questions? We've got I'm sorry, right behind me.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm a GW student. I'm also in marketing. And I had a question for y'all. It might be a little more simple than the other ones, but when you were talking about public trust and measuring decreases in internet use, so if y'all could talk about, from your different perspectives, what that means. So when you're measuring public trust declining, when you're measuring internet usage declining, are you seeing patterns in different regions, like a faster decline in other regions versus some, comparative data? And what companies are doing to ameliorate that?
So I think I wish I could give you actual exact numbers on this, but so one of the things is it's not necessarily a decline in like overall use of the internet, and it's also not necessarily a decline. I think the bigger concern is like there are still billions of people who aren't online. There's lots of people who haven't adopted many of the new technologies that we're talking about here, and it's actually a concern about slowing the adoption of that technology. So predictions that lack of trust will sort of, I think it was one of the studies about data localization said data localization could slow the growth of an information technology industry by like up to 4%. That was an ITIF study from a couple years ago on that. And so there are a lot of different numbers because I think there's a lot of different ways to count like it's hard to quantify what has not yet happened and say we don't, we had this growth rate and it's declined. And some of that is also as you get more and more penetration, it's hardest to reach those, sort of those final users. So I think coming up with actual numbers is really challenging. I think the one of the big issues that we're seeing now when you have something like a particular set of news around what the NSA is doing or what GCHQ is doing or anything like that is when a particular country's government actions or what a company in a particular country is doing sort of breaches public trust. That can have a huge impact, and that sort of reverberates much more broadly on those countries. And it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's because people don't trust the product. Sometimes it's an excuse. There was a term after Snowden that some people started using called Snowden marketing, which was basically companies that were saying, hey, don't trust the US companies, trust us. And that's actually a great way to get, larger market share. We have more secure email. And while if they do have more secure products, that maybe is great. A lot of times they didn't. They were just actually trading on the fact that they were from a different country and that maybe was gonna get them some customers. So I think you do see these patterns, and the concern is that there are a lot of the people that don't use technology, both in the United States and around the world. There are a lot of reasons why, and some of it is access, some of it is cost, and some of it is they don't trust it, they don't understand how it works, and they're not so inclined to learn how it works if they don't trust it. So it's sort of, it's cyclical, which makes it hard to give like exact numbers on sort of the patterns, but definitely reinforces how important the issue is.
But there are certainly case studies. AT&T had the contract to provide telecommunication services to the German parliament and a number of agencies.
Yeah, I think it was Verizon.
Was it Verizon?
It was
Okay.
Verizon, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And Boeing lost a big contract as well, $4.5 billion with the Brazilian government, and a lot of that was suggested it was because of Snowden as well.
And these happen pretty quickly. It's a pretty quick response. And we have clients, we have people who have decided to unplug from Cloudflare. They have a blanket policy. We're not buying anything from any American company. The sad thing for them is that often means they have worse security because they don't have the state-of-the-art security products, but they just made a reflexive, knee-jerk reaction. No U.S. companies.
Yeah, so I just want to echo a little bit of what was said. It's not so much people who are disconnecting, it's people who are not connecting to the internet and slowing down the adoption. So a good example is Indonesia. Indonesia put forth some draft laws to increase regulation on the internet to increase trust overall. They didn't really know how to do it best practice-wise or what they wanted to do. They just knew people were buying things online and not getting what they bought. So they said, okay, we want to monitor the data, so all servers have to be built in Indonesia, have to be processed, all data has to be processed in Indonesia. So went over there, talked to some of the government officials. We actually gave them a tour of a data center in Northern Virginia. It was pristine, it was right out of a movie. It was miles and miles of beautiful white hallways with just some long cables. It had a 10-foot thick steel reinforced concrete wall in a mountainside that you couldn't see from outer space. And they said, and the company said, all right, so this cost us $300 million to build. It took us $200 million of planning over 5 years, and these giant servers that we have 30 of, we change them out every 2 years because they cost $15 million on top of that. So the Indonesian government said, and how many people work here? 25? Well, maybe this isn't going to help us. So how do you secure trust? Well, we have these engineers working on the security all the time. We have people around the globe working on security to funnel to this one site. And then moreover, explain to the Indonesians that on top of this, so the most expensive part of this is the cooling. You're someplace very hot. It needs stable electricity. You should probably invest in infrastructure before you invest in servers. And 3, you're based in something called the Ring of Fire, so why would you want to keep your backup data there? So it was an education campaign, but that was the reaction, and that was some of the rules that were put forth. So in the end, it costs Indonesia investment. It cost some of their local economy and their local citizens from being able to connect and use the best technology, and it definitely costs a few startups from getting investments because you don't want to invest in a company that suddenly has all these extra expenses.
Okay, we're moving to the lightning round. If anybody has any quick questions, we'll have some quick answers. Otherwise, we can adjourn. Oh, yeah, one. Oh, very good.
So while it's going to Richard, I will make a comment on Richard's because it's kind of related to the response, and that is Why would we have a country saying we want to do it this way? It's back to good old protectionism.
Oh, yeah.
We are a large enough economy that, well, maybe we can go it alone. And that is something that is different about, the less friction we have in the internet actually means even a country the size of China or Russia, or even now, let's face it, even the size of the United States can't go it alone anymore.
Adam, on your point about cooling and geological stability of data centers, I would have just observed that there's lots of data centers in Tampa. So it's not without counterexamples. I wanted to ask the group actually about hackers, in the good sense.
The movie, or?
Right. No, in the bug bounty sense, actually. So my company pays out a lot in bug bounties. Cloudflare, I'm sure, does too. I'm sure a lot of the Chamber of Commerce member companies do as well. And it's clear that there's a value added to the economy by these guys that go beat on stuff until it breaks. And that's an area actually where the regulatory environment, I think, is pretty hostile right now. If you look at the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, those guys are really sort of doing it at their peril. Wondering if you guys had any thoughts on where directions are going in that and whether there's any hope for a better situation there, whether there's any recognition of that value.
That is a great question.
I think I would say there are a lot of communities that recognize that value, and it's not just the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I mean, ex-U.S. export controls are another area where we're talking about regulations that are meant to prevent, things that can be harmful from being our export controls broadly are meant to prevent U.S. technologies that could be harmful from ending up in places where we don't want them to end up. But the problem is that when you're dealing with regulating technology, things that may look like malware or surveillance technology that we may want to be controlling the trade of are also very similar to security research tools. So the things that strengthen the internet look a lot like the things that may weaken it. And so I think there are a lot of people that recognize in the policy community, I think, and in government, and obviously in industry, that there's a lot of value. But every time we have an example of, a hacker taking down a big company, or even if, it could be a bunch of teenagers doing something stupid. It could be really sophisticated hacking. There's someone that says they have to pay for this. We have to deal with that. And so that's one of those really, I think, challenging public policy issues where both sides have a very good point, and finding that balance is really hard. I think there is a lot of potential for progress and for sort of figuring out how to make rules that have exemptions and that recognize that are smart enough to recognize the difference between malicious hacking and the good stuff that's happening that's making the internet stronger. I think we have a lot of work to do there, but I think I am, and I think a lot of people here are very optimistic that we are heading in a good direction with that.
For my money, this is one of the most frustrating regulatory barriers out there. This should be so easily fixed. But if it isn't, I think there's a new business model for some Caribbean island to become hacker haven and just get a very big fiber optic pipe to connect all the major corporations of the world, and then hackers can sit on the beach. Hackers can sit on the beach and attack all the companies that need to be tested.
So in fact, this is an example of the internet's bigger that even the United States can't say we're a big enough market, so you'd of course want to stay here. So just as in theory, things should be going better, but we have in fact very concrete evidence in the opposite direction. And what that concrete evidence is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, which is actually where you get more of these prosecutions from. And it has crushed legitimate research. Forget about the guy off, maybe doing is he doing penetration testing because it's a challenge and he's going to tell the company, or is he really a hacker? He's kind of caught. No, this is where you've got academic researchers who've said, you know what, especially as we look at brand name researchers get beaten about the head, I'm not even going to try. And that is very, very effectively quashed research which is not good for the United States economy, not good for our services, not good for people who want to buy American, but we don't know that our stuff is good because we're not allowing people to even look.
For the record, I want to say that I left the White House because of the DMCA. I did not want to be associated with that, and I got out just in time. Okay, other thoughts? Other quick comments? Otherwise, we'll adjourn to conversation. And very good. Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you all, those of you who tuned in, and thank you again, Paul Brigner, and our hosts, WeWork. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. Really good questions, really good answers. And I'll see you at our next ISOC DC event next month.